Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, I'll be reading you a sleep story drawn from a book you may well have met as a child. Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, first published in 1911. It's the tale of a quiet, rather solitary little girl who finds a door hidden behind ivy in the wall of an old English garden and steps through into a place that has been locked away for many years. The kind of story that has lived on bedside tables for generations. Gentle, a little hushed, and made for slow evenings such as this one. And if these stories help you sleep, you should download our app. It's called Tonight. You pick a story, choose your favourite voice, and set a timer, and it all fades out on its own once you've drifted away. No more waking at 3 a.m. to reach for your phone and shut it off. It's a free download. The link's right below this video. Before we get started, take a few moments to get cozy and comfortable. Allow your muscles to relax. Soften your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. The house was called Misselthwaite, and it stood on the edge of the Yorkshire Moor. It was a long, low-shouldered building of dark grey stone with many chimneys and many windows, and in the late autumn evening its slate roofs were dark with damp. The wind had been moving over the moor all afternoon, and now, as the light began to thin, the wind had fallen quiet too. The heather lay in long brown drifts. A single rook crossed the air above the western tower and was gone. Inside, lamps were being lit, one room at a time. The footman moved along the gallery with a small brass taper, and where he passed, a quiet yellow glow showed behind the leaded panes. From the lane below the park gate, the manor looked as it had looked for 300 years. Many windows, a few of them lit, most of them dark. 100 rooms, the housekeeper said, when anyone asked, and most of them shut. The housekeeper was Mrs. Medlock. She was a stout, sensible woman in a black dress, with keys at her belt, and a way of speaking that did not invite questions. She had brought the child up from London by train that morning, and the child had said almost nothing all the way. Now the child stood in the front hall while Mrs. Medlock spoke to the manservant and looked at the polished oak floor. The child's name was Mary Lennox. She was 9 years old. She had been born in India, where her parents had lived, and where, that summer, the cholera had come through the bungalow and left her quite alone. Now she had been sent home to her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, whom she had never met. He was not in the house at present. He travelled, Mrs. Medlock said, and was sometimes away for months. The house was very large and very quiet, and Mary was to keep to her own rooms. Mary did not mind keeping to her own rooms. She had not yet learned to want company. She was a thin, sallow little girl with straight, pale hair, and she had been a sour child in India, and she was still a sour child in Yorkshire, and she did not mind anyone knowing it. That first night, Martha, the housemaid, lit the fire in her small sitting room. Martha was a broad, rosy-cheeked girl from a cottage out on the moor. She had 12 brothers and sisters, she said, while she set the coals, and the youngest of all of them was called Dickon, and Dickon could charm a wild fox to eat out of his hand. Mary listened without seeming to listen. Outside the wind had begun again, low and steady, brushing along the casement. Martha set the brass guard before the fire and went out. Mary stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the moor. The moor was dark now. Here and there a single pinprick of light marked a farm. The window glass was cold against her forehead. Somewhere along a far corridor a clock chimed 9. Then she undressed and got into the high carved bed, and the fire settled lower, and the wind went on across the moor. Mary went exploring the next morning. Martha had brought her bread and milk and porridge at 8, and had told her, in her broad, cheerful Yorkshire way, that she might go about the gardens if she liked, only to keep clear of the locked, walled garden no one had been into for 10 years. Mary had not asked why. She had only put on her coat. The garden stretched a long way. There was a kitchen garden with a high brick wall, and inside it more walls, and inside those fruit trees trained flat against the brick. There were greenhouses with their glass beaded over from the cold, and gravel walks raked clean, and an old fountain at a crossing of paths with no water in it. A wren went past on a low, quick line and into a holly bush. The sky over the moor was the colour of pale wool. Mary walked along the outside of one of the walled gardens and then along another. At the end of a yew alley, she found a robin sitting on the top of a low garden wall. The robin had a round red breast and a very bright eye, and it looked at her with steady curiosity. She stood quite still. The robin tilted its head. Then it flew up onto the branch of a bare-twigged tree and looked back at her over its shoulder, as if to say, "Well, and what now?" She came back to the house at lunchtime with the cold of the moor in her cheeks. After lunch, she walked the long corridors instead. Misselthwaite had 100 rooms, and most of them were shut, and the doors stood in rows along the dim panelled passages with their brass handles polished and their keyholes dark. Mary opened one or two. Inside were furniture under dust sheets, the shapes of chairs and tables under the white linen, a brocade curtain drawn against a north window, the smell of a room that had been closed for a long time. She closed the doors quietly behind her. It was on the second afternoon, or perhaps the third, that she heard the crying. She was in a long corridor she had not been in before. The crying came from somewhere a great way off in the house. It was a child's voice, thin and fretful, and it stopped almost as soon as she heard it. She stood in the corridor for a long minute, and then she turned and went back the way she had come. When she asked Martha that night by the fire, Martha looked at her quickly and said it was the wind. The wind in the chimneys, Martha said, sometimes sounded just like a child crying. That was all. Then Martha changed the subject and spoke about her brother Dickon again, who had charmed a young squirrel that summer to come and sit on his shoulder, and would do, Martha said, until it grew too clever to be charmed. Mary listened and watched the fire and said nothing. Outside, the moor wind was steady against the panes. The crying she had heard had not sounded like the wind. The garden no one had been into for 10 years lay somewhere along the south side of the house. Mary worked out that much by walking the lanes between the walled gardens and noticing where ivy was thickest and where the walls met without any gate that could be seen. She did not say what she was doing. She only walked, and stopped sometimes, and walked again. Spring was beginning to come in. The first crocus had opened in a bank by the long walk, a small yellow flame against the black soil. The thrush was singing somewhere out of sight. The lawns were still brown, but the brown had begun to look softer, more like the colour of earth just before it greens. On a still morning towards the middle of March, Mary found herself once more at the bottom of the kitchen garden. The robin was there again. She had begun to think of it as her robin. It was sitting on the wall as it had sat the first time, with its head tipped and its bright eye fixed on her. She had brought some breadcrumbs in her pocket. She put them down on the wall and stepped back a little. The robin came down at once and ate them in 3 quick, decisive movements, then looked up for more. She had no more bread. The robin hopped along the wall and down into a flower bed where the earth had been freshly turned by some gardener and left in a low ridge. The robin scratched in the loose soil for a moment, then flew up to a low branch and looked down at the place it had been scratching. Mary, who had no particular reason to look, looked too. In the loose earth, in the little hollow the robin had been scratching, something glinted. She knelt down. She put out her cold, thin fingers. It was a small iron ring, half buried, and the ring was attached to a key. The key was old. The iron was darkened, almost black, and there was earth packed into the wards, and the loop of it was rough with rust under her thumb. She turned it over in her palm. It was an old key for a small door. She did not call anyone. She put the key in the pocket of her coat. The robin watched her from the branch with its bright eye, and then it flew off across the wall and out of sight, and Mary stood up and brushed the earth from her knees. She walked back along the kitchen garden very slowly. The key was a small, heavy weight in her pocket. She did not look at the ivy on the high south wall. She felt that to look at it now, with the key in her pocket, would be a kind of giving away of something. So she only walked and breathed and watched the brown ridges of the beds and the wren on the holly and the sky. That night she put the key under her pillow. The fire settled lower in the grate. Far off in the great house, maybe in the wind, maybe not, someone was crying again, and after a while the crying stopped. The next day Mary went out as soon as breakfast was over. She wore her coat and her thick boots, and she took the key in her pocket, and she walked again the lanes between the walled gardens. But this time she walked along the south side, where the ivy was thickest on the high old wall. The wind had dropped. There was a thin, pale sun, and the air smelled faintly of earth and of last year's leaves. Where the ivy hung over the wall, it hung in long curtains, dark green and slightly glossy, with the older leaves a duller olive underneath. She walked along the foot of the wall slowly, putting one hand against the ivy as she went, feeling for the shape of stone behind it. For a long way there was only stone. Then, halfway along, her hand found something different, a hollow, a flat place where the ivy hung over nothing solid. She lifted the long trailing curtain of ivy aside with both hands. There was a small wooden door. It was painted, or had once been painted, a dark green. The paint was almost gone. The ivy had grown over the lintel and across the top, and was held back only because she was holding it. There was a brass knob dulled to a dark green-brown. There was a lock. She took the key out of her pocket. Her hand was steady, the way a child's hand is steady when she has decided to do something. She slid the key into the lock. It went in stiffly, with a little gritting of rust against rust. She turned it. For a second it would not turn. Then it turned with a small, soft click that she felt more than heard. She pushed the door. It did not move. She pushed it again with her shoulder. The ivy gave a slow, rustling sigh and let it go, and the door swung inward a foot and stopped, caught on something in the grass on the other side. Mary stepped through into the gap, and the ivy fell back behind her, and she was inside. She stood with her back to the door, and she looked. She did not know then that she was looking at the garden no one had been into for 10 years. She only knew that she was inside a place that did not look like the rest of Misselthwaite. The walls were the same dark grey stone, but here they were covered, top to bottom, with the climbing, rambling stems of old roses. The roses were not in leaf yet. They were grey-brown wood, thin as harp strings, knotted at the joints, climbing across each other in long swathes. There were beds, you could see, under the long, pale grass, and the shapes of paths. There was a stone seat against the far wall. There was a sundial in the middle of where the paths had once crossed, and the dial was almost lost under a fall of dead ivy. It was a quiet place. It was a walled-in place. Mary did not move for a long minute. Then she walked slowly along the path. She came back the next day. She came back every day after that. She told no one. Martha did not ask, and Mrs. Medlock did not ask, and the old gardener Ben Weatherstaff, who worked the kitchen garden on the other side of the high wall, did not ask either, although he saw her sometimes coming and going, and looked at her with an eye almost as bright as the robin's, and said nothing. The garden was slowly waking. Mary saw it before she understood she was seeing it. She had knelt down on the path one morning to look at what she thought was only dead grass, and she had seen, pushing up through the brown, thin, pale green spikes, dozens of them in clumps all the way down the bed. They were not weeds. She had looked at the kitchen garden enough by now to know weeds. These were bulbs coming up. Snowdrops, perhaps, crocuses, later things she did not yet have the name for. She found a piece of pointed wood near the wall, and she began very carefully to clear the dead grass from around the green spikes. She worked slowly. She did not pull. She lifted the brown grass aside and laid it on the path, and the green spikes stood a little straighter in the air around them. Day by day she worked. She did not know what she was doing in any proper gardener's sense. She only cleared spaces. Around the snowdrops, around the small clumps of crocus, around a thin grey-brown stem that, when she scratched at it with her thumbnail, showed pale, fresh green underneath, which meant, she had heard Ben Weatherstaff say it across the wall to a hedge, that it was wick. Wick was the Yorkshire word. It meant alive. The bush was alive. The roses, when she scratched at them, were wick too, almost all of them. the wood under the bark a quiet, living green. The robin came in and out of the garden as it pleased. It had a nest, she gradually understood, somewhere in the ivy along the north wall. It treated her, after the first few days, as a large, slow, harmless creature that occasionally produced crumbs. It sat on the handle of her trowel once, while she rested. It sat on the seat beside her. It cocked its head at her hands when she dug, and when she lifted out a stone, it darted down to look for whatever the stone had been hiding. She found that first week the small things a garden gives back to whoever is willing to look. A clay marble in the soil, blue-white. A long rusted pair of secateurs at the foot of the stone seat. A label of slate with a name on it she could not read because the chalk had gone. A bird's egg, broken and empty, pale blue. The sky overhead changed slowly from wool grey to a pale washed blue. The wind on the moor went round to the south. Somewhere out beyond the walls, the lambs had begun to be born. Inside the four walls, the year turned slowly, taking its first cautious steps forward, with a thin, pale girl kneeling on the path. Dickon came into the garden because Mary brought him. She had been thinking about him for some time. It came to her that she could not alone do what the garden needed, and that Martha's brother, who could charm foxes, would not be the sort of person who told. So one day at the end of March, she walked out across the moor and found him. He was sitting on a low stone with his pony grazing beside him and a thin pipe at his lips, playing something slow and not quite a tune, while a red squirrel sat on a stump nearby with its tail curled, and a young pheasant watched from the bracken. He was 12 years old. He had a wide red mouth and round cheeks and very blue eyes, and he wore patched corduroys and a homespun jacket, and he looked at Mary as if she were one more wild thing come down out of the heather to see what he was about. She told him slowly what she had found. She told him in the careful, flat way she had of telling things, with her hands quite still. He listened, and he did not interrupt. When she had finished, he said in his broad Yorkshire that he would come, and that he would not tell anyone, and that they would want, he reckoned, a few seeds. He came the next morning with a packet of seeds in each pocket and a small spade across his shoulder. He came in through the door under the ivy and stood inside the garden as Mary had stood, quiet for a long minute. Then he walked slowly along the path, and he knelt by the snowdrops, and he scratched at the rosewood with his thumbnail, and he said, almost under his breath, that it was wick, all of it, almost all of it. It had been let alone, that was all. What followed in the days after that was the long, slow work of bringing a garden back. They began with the rose stems. Dickon showed her how to find the dead wood and how to cut it out cleanly near to the live wood with the small knife he kept in his pocket. They cut and laid the dead pieces in a soft brown pile by the seat. He showed her how to thin a clump of snowdrops, how to lift a few bulbs gently with a spade and tease them apart, how to set them again into the loosened earth, firmed down with the flat of the hand. He showed her how to plant the seeds. A row of mignonette here, where it would catch the warmth of the south wall. a row of larkspur, a row of poppies, the small black grains tipped from his palm into the shallow drill they had drawn with a stick. He pressed the soil down with the back of the rake. He sprinkled water from a tin can. He worked slowly. He worked the way he played his pipe, without any hurry, as if the day were long. Mary worked beside him. The robin came and sat on a stake nearby and watched them both with its bright eye. There came a morning in early April when the work in the garden took on its own slow rhythm. The day began cool. Mary and Dickon met at the door under the ivy a little after 8. Dickon had a basket on his arm. In the basket were a few plants in small clay pots. 3 young pansies, 2 clumps of forget-me-not lifted from a corner of his mother's cottage garden, and a small rosemary cutting wrapped in damp moss. He set the basket down on the stone seat. He laid out the tools beside it. 2 trowels, the small knife, a ball of garden twine, a pair of scissors, the watering can. They began with the bed along the south wall. The bed was perhaps 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. They cleared it first. They knelt at one end, side by side, and they took out, one by one, the long, pale tendrils of bindweed, and the rosettes of dandelion, and the small, flat mats of moss that had crept out from the path. They did not pull. Dickon had taught her not to pull. They eased the trowel down beside the root. They tipped the trowel, and the weed came up with its long, pale root unbroken, and they set the weed in a bucket by the path. It took an hour to clear the bed. They did not speak much. The robin came and sat on the back of the stone seat for a while and watched them with one bright eye. A blackbird sang somewhere on the far side of the wall, and another answered it from the orchard beyond. The sun moved a few inches along the top of the wall, and the shadow of the wall on the path grew thinner. When the bed was clear, they broke up the soil. Dickon used the small fork. He pushed the fork in to its full depth, lifted, turned the soil over so that the dark earth from below came up to the air. He went slowly. The soil came up in soft, heavy clods. Mary, with her trowel, broke the clods down. She tapped them with the back of the trowel, and they fell apart into loose crumbs, and the small white roots of the weeds they had missed showed pale against the brown, and she picked them out and put them in the bucket. They raked the bed level. Dickon drew the rake the long way down the bed in slow, even strokes, and the soil settled into a fine, dark, level surface, the colour of strong tea. They stepped back and looked. It was a satisfying thing to see. Then they planted. Dickon drew 2 shallow drills with the end of a stick, the length of the bed, 2 handspans apart. He tipped a small heap of poppy seed into his palm. He pinched a few grains between thumb and finger and let them fall into the drill. 1 slow pinch every few inches. the small black grains scattering into the dark earth. Mary watched the seeds fall. Some of them lodged in the loose crumbs. Some of them rolled a little before settling. Dickon worked the length of one drill and Mary the length of the other. He showed her how. Her first pinches were too thick. He showed her again, and the next pinches were better. They closed the drills. Dickon went along with the flat back of the rake, drawing the soil gently across the seeds, covering them to no more than the depth of the seed itself. He pressed the soil firm with the flat of his hand. Mary did the same on her drill. The bed looked, after that, almost the same as it had before they planted, except that there were two faint, almost invisible lines down its length where the rake had passed. Last of all came the water. Dickon filled the watering can at the old standpipe by the wall. He carried it back slowly so it would not slosh. He held the can high, a foot above the bed, and tipped it gently, and the water came out of the rose in many small, soft streams, and the dark soil drank and went a shade darker still, and the small grains under the soil began their long, quiet wait. By then it was nearly noon. They sat on the stone seat. Dickon broke a piece of bread from his pocket and gave half to Mary. The robin came down and stood by Mary's boot, eyeing the crumbs with frank professional interest. They ate. They did not speak. The garden around them was a few square yards larger in living, growing space than it had been when they had come in that morning. The crying came back. Mary had heard it twice more in the long corridors since the day she had first found the key, and each time it had stopped before she could trace it. But one night, late in April, after a long, warm afternoon in the garden, she lay awake in her high carved bed, and the crying came again. And this time she got up. She put a candle in a brass holder, and she lit it from the embers of the fire. Wrapping her woolen gown around her, she opened the door of her room and went out into the corridor. The house was dark. The lamps had been turned down hours before. The corridor was full of the long, slow ticking of the grandfather clock at the head of the stairs, and the faint creaks of old timber settling, and, somewhere ahead of her, the thin, fretful sound of a child crying. She followed it. She passed 3 doors and turned a corner and passed 3 more. She crossed a small landing and went down a step she had not known was there. The crying was nearer now. She came at last to a door she had not opened before. A line of yellow light showed underneath it. She put her hand on the knob. The room inside was warm and high-ceilinged. A fire burned in the grate. A small lamp glowed beside the bed. In the bed, in a great carved 4-poster much too large for him, lay a thin boy with a pale face and dark hair and eyes that were almost too large for his face. He had been crying. He looked at Mary with no astonishment at all, as though he had been expecting her for years. His name, she learned, was Colin. He was her cousin. He was the son of Mr. Archibald Craven, the uncle who travelled. He had been ill, the doctors said, since he was a baby. He was going to be ill, the doctors said, for the rest of his life. He was kept to his rooms because the noise of the house tired him, and the servants spoke softly when they passed his door because his nerves were delicate, and he had not, since he could remember, been outside Misselthwaite at all. He told her this in his thin, clear voice, half imperious, half uncertain, and she sat at the foot of his bed and listened. She did not pity him. Pity, in the country of children, is almost an insult. She listened to him as one child listens to another, with her grey-green eyes steady on his face. And when he had finished, she told him, slowly, about the garden. She told him about the door under the ivy. She told him about the snowdrops and the rosewood that was wick. She told him about Dickon and the robin and the bed they had cleared that morning along the south wall. She did not tell him to come and see. She only told him. He listened, and his face changed by very small degrees from the pinched white of a child who has been crying to the still, careful face of a child who is listening to something he has not heard before. The candle burned lower. The fire settled. After a long while, Colin slept. It was several weeks before Colin came out. There was a great deal of slow planning. There was the matter of the servants, and Mrs. Medlock, and the doctor who came every other day from the village. And there was the chair, the long wicker garden chair with the wheels, which had been bought years before in case Colin should ever want to use it, and had stood unused under a dust sheet in a storeroom ever since. It was Dickon who pushed the chair the first day. He pushed it slowly along the gravel paths, with Mary walking beside, and Colin in the chair under a woolen rug, with his thin hand resting on the arm. They came round the corner of the kitchen garden. They passed the holly bush. They came at last to the high south wall and the long fall of ivy. Mary lifted the ivy aside. Dickon pushed the chair through the door. Mary closed the door behind them. They stopped, all three of them, just inside. It was May then. The garden had gone on while no one was watching. The grass had turned green, and along the south wall the snowdrops had finished and the daffodils had come and were finishing, and a long bank of forget-me-not had opened into a low blue mist along the foot of one bed. The rose stems were in young leaf, pale red where the new leaves uncurled. The apple tree by the seat was in full white blossom. They had not been sure in March whether it was wick. Bees were working it, slow and steady, with a steady hum. Colin did not speak. He looked. He looked from the apple blossom to the forget-me-not, from the forget-me-not to the climbing roses, from the climbing roses to the robin on the stone seat. His hand on the arm of the chair tightened a little, and then loosened. And then he turned his face up to the sky inside the four walls, which was the same sky as the sky outside the four walls, but which seemed to him then like a different one. He came every day after that. Mary walked beside the chair on the way out and on the way back, and Dickon pushed, and the servants in the house, who had not been told, noticed only that the boy was being taken out for air, which the doctor had not actually forbidden, only never recommended. The chair stood by the stone seat. The rug lay folded on the chair. After a few days, Colin asked, in his thin, clear voice, whether he might try to stand up. He stood. He held on, the first time, to the arm of the chair and to Dickon's shoulder. He stood for perhaps a minute. The next day, 2. The day after that, he took a step, and then another. By the end of the week he could walk, slowly, with one hand on Mary's arm, the length of the path from the door under the ivy to the apple tree. The robin watched him from the seat with its bright, unsurprised eye. The summer came on. It came slowly, the way summer comes in Yorkshire, in long, damp, warm afternoons and clear, cool mornings, and the slow, steady lengthening of the light. Inside the four walls of the garden, everything that had been wick in March was in full leaf and full flower by July. The roses were the great event of June. They came on in waves. The old climbers along the walls put out long sprays of pale pink and cream and white, and the air all along the south wall became, for 2 weeks together, the most strongly scented air in Yorkshire. Bees worked steadily in the climbing roses. The bees were always there now. They were a low, even sound along the wall all the long hours of the day. The mignonette they had planted in April was up and flowering. The larkspur had come too. As for the poppies, tall, thin, papery red ones, and the small black grains of them had become a long, uneven row of bright, unsteady cups that moved in the smallest breath of wind. The forget-me-not had spread. The apple tree had set fruit. Small, hard green knots along the branches where the blossom had been. Colin walked the paths now without help. He had grown brown in the face and stronger in the legs, and his hair, which had been lank, had thickened. He could kneel by a bed and weed it himself, slowly and with a careful seriousness. Mary worked beside him. Dickon came in and out as the days needed. The pony grazed sometimes in the long meadow outside the wall, and the red squirrel came down the apple tree on certain days, and the robin had hatched a second brood of nestlings in the ivy along the north wall, and was busy from dawn until late evening carrying small green caterpillars to the nest. On one of the long evenings of midsummer, the 3 of them sat together on the stone seat. The light had gone golden and then rose, and was beginning to go grey. The bees had gone quiet. The day's heat lay low along the brick. Somewhere out beyond the wall, on the moor, a curlew was calling. a long, slow falling note, and then another, very far off. Colin had his head against the back of the seat. Mary had her hands in her lap, the dirt of the day still under her nails. Dickon was whittling a small piece of willow, slowly, without looking at it. No one said anything for a long while. After a while, Dickon put the piece of willow in his pocket. He stood up. He said, in his quiet Yorkshire way, that it was time to be getting in. Mary stood. Colin stood, easily, without thought. They walked together along the path to the door under the ivy. Dickon went out first. Mary held the ivy aside for Colin. Colin stepped through. Mary stepped through last and pulled the door to behind her, and the lock clicked softly, and the key went back into her pocket. The garden behind the closed door was quiet. The roses bent gently against the wall. The robin settled on its nest. The light went from gold to rose to grey, and the long evening of midsummer came slowly down over the moor. And inside the four walls were the leaves and the bees and the small wooden door, locked again for the night.